Hello and welcome to Snide's Return, a tabletop roleplay podcast. My guest today has been on the rise from less favourable times, an ascension to be more precise, from the horrific through the wrathful and on to the glorious, from now until, well, one may suggest deep into the 41st millennium. Not one to hold secrets too tightly as they broadcast their message across many mediums from the inside of a particularly special vault. My guest is no warmonger, more of a strategic artiste with an eye and steady hand to bring us glimpses of wow. Come and take a ticket and sit in the waiting room of a doctor and storyteller as we welcome podcaster, TTRPG content creator, YouTuber, and wargame enthusiast Chris Handley. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam. I think that covered everything. There's a lot of stuff there to unpack.
Well, there is. And before we go into some of the stuff and try and unpack some of the stuff that was mentioned there in the intro, Chris, how did you yourself get into tabletop role-playing games, please?
So I originally, I got into wargaming first because a friend got for Christmas like Warhammer 40,000 second edition, the classic Blood Angels on the cover of that box with the God, how many 20 Space Marines and however many damned Gretchen and Orcs and a card Orc Dreadnought in there. So I think that was like 1990 Christmas 1994, and then through wargaming and obviously various Games Workshop products then, I think it was about 2 years later, my parents came back from going to the local city, living out in the middle of nowhere. Takes a bit of time to get to civilization. A bit more civilization anyway when you're in deepest, darkest Herefordshire. And they came back with a box and they were like, "Oh, we thought you might like this." And I was like, "Okay, what is it?" And it was like, I don't think even they knew quite what it was. I think they thought it was a board game. But no, it was the red dragon on a black box, classic D&D with I can't remember the name of the villain in it, and you get the red plastic pieces for your characters, and the collection of dice, and obviously there's just character classes. There's nothing else. You're either a elf or you are a dwarf. There is no variation in it. So I played that, and my friends played that because they were like, okay, we'll try this role play thing out. And then from there, it was like Arcane magazine was randomly being sold at the local supermarket. Picked that up, learnt about other RPGs that were about, and so asked for Star Wars West End Game Star Wars Second Edition Revised, which is still a bloody classic. And then I think it was in the issue of Arcane that had like the 50 greatest RPGs ever, and I think that was like Christmas 1996 when that came out, that issue, or it was around then anyway, and it listed of course listed Vampire the Masquerade like literally like I think first was Call of Cthulhu, second was D&D, third was Vampire, and I was like, Vampire, this sounds pretty cool, and I bought that when I was mostly aged 16. So that was like 1998, something like that. So yeah, I think that's basically how I got into it. Yeah, and on the wargaming side, obviously things that kind of made role playing quite a natural thing was like obviously Necromunda back in the day, classic Necromunda, was just such heavy RPG influences, even though it's a skirmish wargame.
All right. Well, I mean, there's a lot of things to unpack out of what you've just said, let alone what I said before. Anyway, so deviating. So that was how you sort of found your way into sort of tabletop role-playing games. Before I sort of delve into some of that too much, where can we find you and everything you're associated with?
Okay, so you can find everything to do with the podcast. The best place to go is to www.darker-days.org. That's the podcast website. You're going to find there 200 plus episodes.
Mm.
We've been running for 13 years. That means some of the older episodes are really bloody long because attention spans have changed and we have shortened episodes to accommodate that. And yeah, we cover a lot of stuff. I mean, predominantly we started off with World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness content, but we've diversified over the years because you have to keep things fresh. So yeah, there's that. Obviously, we're on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. We do stream every so often, not as recently because we all have busy lives. And then if you go to www.christopher-handley.com, that's my professional just web page that has just me in general, because I don't just podcast and I don't just write games. Yeah.
All right. Well, I will make sure that the links are down in the description below this podcast. So please scroll down, support Chris. You can find them on Twitter. Join over the 1,400 followers they've got there. There's over 700 on Instagram and over 500 on YouTube. So really back the Darker Days Radio podcast, the website and everything you guys are doing there. So where did picking this up, taking an interest in Vampire the Masquerade, then sort of, how did the podcast start and how did your content creation for the game systems, where did those two things sort of stem from?
Right. Okay. So I guess so the podcast was started by Mark Hope and Vincent Florio back in, oh God, if I said 13 years ago, so that's like 2009. Yeah, does that feel right? Yeah, that's when I finished my PhD. So yes, that's right. And that was going for about, they carried it on for a good year, and then Vincent left, and then Mike, my current co-host, joined. And then I joined after that. And really, the way we were involved in it was because back in the day, podcasts had their own forums. We didn't need, because now everyone has a Discord. We had forums there, and obviously we were chatting there. Most of the people who were listeners of the podcast, though, were also members of a very old forum for World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness stuff called Shadow and Essence, which I think is still up and still runs. And we've known each other in some respects via that route for a long time. And basically, I submitted an idea for a secret frequency. So that means what we do on the podcast is we when we say a secret frequency, we take a real world myth, legend, urban legend, or something just weird scientific, and how you could use that in your horror games. How would you build the rules around it? Which games does it fit the best? So I suggested the Devil Dogs and the Legend of Black Vaughn, because that's a local legend to where I grew up, because it's the basis of Hound of the Baskervilles. And then from that, it was like, oh, do you want to come on and talk about ghouls in Vampire the Requiem? And then it was just basically because of what was going on, Mike took more control of the podcast, and then it was essentially myself, and then we've just gone from there. And it's been 12 years of me and Mike effectively running the podcast and maintaining it pretty much how it's always been. So that's how we got into the podcasting. Content creation, actual game content creation, I think we always do it to a certain extent. When you've got forums, you put some ideas out for free, it's well received. So we've kind of done that before. We tried to do a small zine back in the day for Darker Days Radio, which was okay. It was a lot of work. Trying to do it on Word is a lot of work. Microsoft Word does not like doing documents, and it certainly doesn't like doing huge documents. So one of my Storytellers Vault products, the Venice Unmasked, that originally was a Word document. That was all on Word and laid out in Word. And it was a work of love to write that out originally, and then a further work of love to rebuild it in Adobe to turn it into a Storyteller Vault product. So Yeah, we've done various things, and we've done free scenarios. So we were lucky enough to be the first podcast to put out an actual play for Vampire the Requiem. Vampire the Masquerade Fifth Edition. And so the scenario that I designed for that live play, we then put out for free.
Hmm.
And then obviously Storyteller Vault was a thing, and it was like, okay, do we actually put it out there in a more official, as official as you can get, obviously, but in
Yeah.
a format for people to get hold of. And then we've just gone from there, and obviously that leads to you doing freelance work, which gets in the way of doing your own Storyteller's Vault work. But that's just how it is.
Okay. So, yeah, you mentioned the Storyteller's Vault, a great enterprise, and I know various systems have their own sort
Yeah,
of community content uh, repositories, I think is a
yeah,
fair way of saying it. So, Ascension Night, you mentioned there, and you've got
yes, that was the
thr-
first one. Yeah,
yes. So I noticed there were three others that have been released since then. The latest one being Project Black Light.
yeah.
Again, a link will be in the description below. Scroll down, check out this content. It's been used and lauded and heavily reviewed. So go and check that out. So with a project for something like the Storyteller's Vault or one of the other repositories, like one of the other game systems, where does a lot of your inspiration come from?
So I would say with World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness, the main source of inspiration is in the one aspect it's choosing a location, and it's always I think it's always choosing somewhere you know with a great deal of intimacy, so you feel like you can do it justice. And so Manchester, I lived in Manchester for like 8 years, 9 years, doing degree and PhD. So it was lived in Manchester for a good while, and I ran a Vampire the Requiem Chronicle based in Manchester, and so really with fifth edition of Vampire the Masquerade, and I'll be brutally honest, mate. If you just squint and you think about it, you can see some of the DNA of Requiem in this new version of Masquerade, and that's a good thing because it shows that it's open up. You can do a lot more things with it, and it just
Hmm.
so I ported over ideas that I had, and um, and so went from there. Obviously, with Change of the Lost with Venice, I've been to Venice 3 times for Carnival. I got married in Venice, so again, Venice is very close to my heart, and I've done a lot of reading and research on that, reading about the myths of it, and so that was kind of a labor of love to write that book.
Hmm.
So I think with World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness, I think it's often places intimately, and certain themes you want to explore, and that drives me to want to create things. Often it's the thing you're doing is taking ideas you've done on the tabletop and going, way up, that'll be actually really good. Or more often these days, it's taking a scenario that I've designed for a demo game at an event
Okay.
where you get to test it. And then
Hmm.
obviously the great thing with the podcast, because we have Mike is based in the US on the East Coast, Pete is based in Australia, Chig is based in Texas. There's a good few of us, so others of the podcast when they go to events will go, well, actually, I'll take that scenario and I'll use it there, and we can
Okay.
collate that feedback and learn from it, and
Hmm.
therefore finely tune the scenario. And I think beyond that, and I think with the Vampire the Masquerade scenarios, it's trying to show what more you can do with vampire than I think what a lot of people think vampires about.
Okay.
Um, I'm not. I mean, one of the reasons I was drawn to Requiem a lot was because when it first came out, it just felt very fresh and quite gritty
Hmm.
and not hung up so much on its meta plot. And with fifth edition, there's an opportunity to explore the holes in the setting a lot more easily because they've reinforced that there's a lot of untrustworthy narrators out there
Hmm.
within the books. And I detest, to a certain extent, detest the idea that of what people think Vampire the Masquerade kind of looks like, or how it should be played, like preening vampires at Elysium all the time, and so forth. I really kind of lean into the more like vampire for me should be it's kind of like train spotting. Like,
Okay, yeah.
vampires' lives aren't great unless they're really like doing something pretty spectacular to live the high life. Like, life as one of the undead is crap to a certain extent, and brutal, and also like dressing up in crushed velvet and I would say into too much of an avant-garde way is a quick road to getting a stake through the heart from a hunter. So I lean into that kind of gritty. The UK series, the original series of Being Human, is a good point of reference. As I said, like Train Spotting and those kind of like that type of media as an inspiration, rather than the, Buffy kind of type things. And what is it? What's the other stuff you would get, like where they're a bit too preen? Like, I'm not really one for True Blood. That gets a little bit, a bit silly in my books, but that's just because I'm picky.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Obviously, people listening can't see it, but I can see the fifth edition book over your shoulder.
Yeah.
So clearly, something that you have to hand to reference to go into it. And you've collaborated recently on a project. Our Graves Are Empty. So what's it been like
Yes.
collaborating to someone else's project?
That's been really good fun because it it lifts off your shoulders the need to develop the final product yourself. You can just be given the brief and write for it. I've worked on another project that's still in development that is similar. Again, it's another Storyteller Vault product for Vampire 5th edition. I've also worked on another one which was for Requiem, which is the 2nd edition David Clan book. So in all those cases, it's you giving up the freedom and control so that you can just focus on the very thing you need to write is good in some respects, because then you don't need to juggle so much stuff and figure out how the product as a total will fit together. You just need to do what you've been told. Now, obviously, as part of that, there is obviously a conversation that always happens about, well, you've been told you should write this, but you come with your own ideas, and so those things will change, and you get to inject how you would do things into it. And the important thing, I think, with Our Graves Are Empty is that Khaldun Kahil, who is behind, who's developing that, and has done the Player's Guide to Sabbat. I think it's called Player's Guide to Sabbat. There's a lot of a lot of ST Vault takes on playable Sabbat books. So he's done his own take on it because he worked on the Sabbat book for the official line.
Yeah.
And so when he came to me, like, do you want to work on this? Is because he was inspired by what we had done for the Manchester kind of setting that we're doing with Ascension Night and the other 3 scenarios. So he was like, actually, what you've done with Make Blood Boil is kind of the feel I want, but for a Sabbat-centric scenario.
Okay.
So that's kind of where we went with it. The difference is that this scenario is not embedded into one particular location. So we thought a lot more about, well, what if you want to use this in your own chronicle, how would you go and alter some of the scenes to fit what you require? So it's, in some respects, it's a scenario, yes, but there are elements of where it's a bit more of a toolbox to go, we're going to take the scene, but here are the tools to make it just right for your needs.
No, I love that kind of resource for storytellers, GMs, DMs, whatever the system, whatever the platform being used, the ability to take and adapt and make it your own, but have almost the permission from the writers and the publishers to say, have at it, make it yours. I love the flexibility that's now coming into that style of release for the games we love.
And I think it's an important point to note that I think Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition is more like that because of the way that RPG publishing has gone. White Wolf, original White Wolf, got locked into what is known as the supplement treadmill. Like, they had to produce another book. They had to produce another book to keep it going, to keep the distributors happy to buy their stuff, to keep the lights on. Whereas now you see, we're making the books that we want to make that feel right for the product line, but we're not rushing them out. We're doing them when it's right and we have the right ideas. And that means that I think the books, to do the supplement treadmill, that was, I think, part of the reason why you had the meta plot, because obviously people were buying the books sometimes predominantly just to read the meta plot and nothing else. They weren't actively playing the game. They just wanted to know where the story went. So you had that, and then you had the change with Requiem, which was they got rid of the meta plot, and you just go, this is what's true up till now. These are all optional books, but what is true now in the core game is this. Everything past it, have at, do what you need. There's no other truths that you need to think about. And I think Masquerade now is sitting in between those two philosophies, as it were. Because on the one hand, they want people to have more freedom to do what they want to have it their game. On the other hand, they do still have to develop a story because of their requirements for transmedia, which means, for developing the IP for computer games and TV media, etc.
See, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than potentially some people give everybody credit for. So we mentioned there some people reading some of the supplements, or even some of the newer books for lore and sort of the background story behind things. Do you get to play much at the moment with sort of the writing and your own sort of personal life and things like that? Do you get to play much?
I think I do try to. The problem is, I think the last 2 years have been difficult, right? And so I think there's still I've personally had still, obviously due to personal related issues, a slight hesitancy to gather too many people at home. I prefer ultimately playing in person rather than online. I like doing streamed games, but I think when you do games in person, I find it a bit easier to relax into what I'm doing, and there's a lot less like shit assaulting your eyes for your attention, kind of when you've got screens and everything and so forth. So and also with the pandemic, it's been it's kind of been an opportunity for me to catch up on painting toy soldiers a lot. So I freely admit I've maybe been playing a bit more wargaming and that type of thing than role play games, but I don't really see the two things as kind of mutually exclusive. I think maybe the break from one thing for a bit helps you kind of digest ideas and prepare for something, for your next new thing you're going to run. Also, I started a new job in like the last 6 months, and it's been like a hell of a learning curve on stuff. So that plus learning to drive, and my brain is just Swiss fucking cheese with stuff.
Information overload a little bit.
Yeah.
That's fair. Well, have you passed your driving test yet, or is that?
No, good luck trying to get a test anytime soon. I passed theory fine. That was like full marks on the multiple choice. So it's like I just want the test done. I would like to drive somewhere. Yeah.
Good luck with that for the future, anyway.
Yeah.
So you mentioned there sort of leaning back into the wargaming, and I'll sort of move on to linked products, but we'll stick with this for a second. Do you see that as another side passion, or do you use it as more of a downtime activity? How do your various passions sort of play out in your recreational time?
Is wargaming a side passion? No, I think it vies for my attention a lot. So obviously I've been wargaming longer. In some respects, wargaming longer than I've been doing role play games, but in other respects, I've been role playing longer than war games because when I finished my degree, I pretty much went no to wargaming for a good like 5 years.
Okay.
I worked part time in a Games Workshop store during my degree, so like it was some pretty insane weekends teaching people to wargame, painting far too many models in time for games day for huge demonstration games, things like that. So I had to have a bit of a break from it, and then that allowed me to do a lot more role playing and obviously do my PhD. And then it was when I was in Germany, I got back into wargaming, and that was through getting back into War Machine and Hordes by Private Press, because I think they had a relatively new edition out at the time, and I was like, oh, okay, I'll get back into this. It's a nice system. I like the setting, and that was actually partly because they'd just before I got back into that, they'd brought out their second edition of their RPG, Iron Kingdoms, that was based upon and that edition. So, to explain, War Machine Hordes is like about 20 years. It's going to be 20 years old, and it had its first product out back in 2003 for D20, which was the Witchfire trilogy. From that game setting, they created the war game that is now just announced its fourth edition is coming up, and they had a second edition of the RPG, but that RPG used a system based on the war game. So I basically picked up that roleplay game, and I was like, okay, I'm back in. I'm buying the miniatures because I need because the thing is, the miniatures were really good to crack out when the RPG used exactly the same system as the war game. You were like, actually, miniatures on the board weren't a distraction. And that's an interesting conversation. Do I find miniatures a distraction to when you're playing role play games? And the answer is yes, unless it's for a really complicated combat scene, in which case crack them out, because for some people it's the best way for them to engage in what could be quite overwhelming in the theatre of the mind. And of course, it's even better when the miniatures are exactly designed for that setting. So then you're kind of like, you're really immersed into it. So yeah, basically wargaming, competes for my attentions all the time. And, it's, I don't have time to paint huge armies anymore. I have done it, and as I've had more freelance work, my time to paint large armies has diminished. Instead, it's like, oh, I'm going to paint another gang for Necromunda because it's just like it's 20 models. Yeah, they look interesting. And then that means I've just got even more weirdos for Wrath and Glory when I run it, because then I can go, oh, I need some crazy Imperial cultists. Here's my Redemptionist gang. That'll do. So yeah, but I think there is a symbiotic relationship somewhere in there, because being actively engaged definitely in the Warhammer war games, in whatever avenue into them you go, and there are many avenues to enjoy Games Workshop products, and the same with Iron Kingdoms and War Machine, keeps me enthused to go like, this is really cool. Has this been explored fully in the RPG? And then when you get to write stuff for the RPGs, you're like, oh right, okay, so we can paint in the region that has been only really sketched out in the war game. It's the classic question of if you look at Age of Sigmar and the Soulbound RPG, which I've only done a tiny bit of work on that, but it's the classic question of like when that first started up and people complained about that setting when it first came out because it was just so weird and different. But you had this question of like, who does the farming in this setting? This setting is because Age of Sigmar is a post-apocalyptic fantasy setting. I don't think many people get that it's a post-apocalyptic fantasy setting, and where the forces of order are reclaiming the realms and humanity there. But you're like, who's doing the cooking? Who's doing the farming? Who's building the buildings here? We only ever see these crazy combatants. And that's the same for any of the settings, because war games are such a specific slice of those settings, and that slice is really the outer skin of the onion, because it's the extremity when the rival factions meet, but they don't meet every day, all the time, every year. It's flashpoints that you explore in the war games, whereas in the roleplay games, you're dealing with the drudgery of living in a hive city, or I don't know, traveling to bloody Altdorf in the rain yet again because it's the Warhammer world, stuff like that.
Yeah, you mentioned it there. As you sort of picked up a few references, Wrath and Glory. So, and sort of spinning on from what you were saying about exploring deeper into a system away from flashpoints, as it were. So, in Wrath and Glory, we get to explore Gilead, the Gilead system. What was it like writing and bringing Wrath and Glory to life within the Warhammer 40,000 world?
So the thing with it's a bit more nuanced with Wrath and Glory, because Wrath and Glory was originally developed by the team at Ulysses Spiel North America. And Cubicle 7 had the license for the Warhammer Fantasy RPG. And so I don't know the ins and outs of what happened, so I'm not going to say anything like that. Or because the core game system of Wrath and Glory is good, was solid. But that license transferred to Cubicle 7, and so I think I basically just chatted the ear off my developer at Cubicle 7, Zach, when I met him at UK Games Expo, and then it was like, okay, do you want to work on this? I was like, oh god, yes. And so essentially it was putting out a revised version of the Wrath and Glory core book. And I think the goal there was Cubicle 7 wanted to deliver it in a format that was comparable to what they wanted in style, in the way they do with the Warhammer Fantasy RPG. I think if you compare the two books, you would go, they're made by the same company. And to address some of the criticisms that people had of the game book, the original incarnation of the game book, and the setting. Well, not the setting really, but the mechanics maybe. And so my kind of work on that was to go through some of the archetypes, some like the orc boys and rogue traders and so forth, and rewrite them to inject enough flavor into that limited amount of text. So when you write about orcs, you really need to make it feel orky without it being that you're writing in the orc speak, if that makes sense. You need to kind of make it sound like you're writing about people that are brutal and cunning, or cunning and brutal. And the other bit that I was mainly working on was the Games Master section in Wrath and Glory. And so that was an opportunity for me to really highlight that Wrath and Glory is not a Super Friends game, and also to reinstate the fact that it can be a horror game, and there's lots of tunable dials to set the expectations for your players, because people interact with the setting to a greater or lesser degree with the horror and war and so forth, and the type of stories you can tell in that. So that was really what I was going for. I don't think we really touched what the Gilead system is. We didn't change that up. It was really more about the presentation of the original material in a way that Cubicle 7 was satisfied as a product they would be happy to put out. And as I said, like, part of Wrath and Glory is, and God, you get this all the time, right? And I've ranted about this on the Realm of Fire podcast, is so there are previous Warhammer 40,000 RPGs out there. Such as Dark Heresy and Only War and Rogue Trader. And these use a percentile system, much like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, much like Call of Cthulhu, which Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was essentially derived from. And people go, Wrath and Glory, it's not it's not horrific enough. Oh, it doesn't make sense. You can play like a Space Marine, an Eldari, and pick and an Orc all in the same party. You're like, whoa, whoa, whoa! It's like this book provides you the tools, and all the tools are there. How you put your party together, what you allow your players to play as a party, is a different question, because you can go in the book. There are rules for playable Orcs, playable Eldar, playable Space Marines, playable Guard, whatever. Right? That doesn't mean you're going to play parties that mix all of that up all the time. It just means you've got the tools to construct the framework for your agents that are doing things. So if you want to be all just Space Marines, do it. If you want to just be all a rogue trader and some Astra Militarum and so forth, do that. If you want to play just Orc Boys, do that. They don't. But also equally, because it does happen in novels, there are times when the 40k universe is such that a Eldari and a Space Marine go, okay, we hate each other so much, but we hate Necrons more, or we hate Tyranids more. So we'll deal with this later.
Yeah, the enemy of my enemy kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's exciting, because those things can happen. And I think, and so it was really looking at that, and also looking at the fact that you can play Wrath and Glory where you look at an event from different angles. So you go, okay, and this has happened in published material where you go, story 1, we're just tier 1 guardsmen. Life is hard, death comes quick. And then you look at the same story, but at tier, say, 3, where you're the Space Marine sent in later to deal with the really bad stuff that's in the same thing. So, and I think that's really interesting for Wrath and Glory in that presentation. My other argument, and this is something I've said before, is people go, oh well, the system of the old 40k RPGs is what makes them horrific. And I'm just like, wait a minute, they're not more. Well, no, they didn't say it wasn't the system that was more horrific. They said the older ones were more horrific than the new one. I was like, wait a minute. The only thing, if you scrub away the IP of Dark Heresy and Rogue Trader, all you're left with is Call of Cthulhu, the mechanics of Call of Cthulhu. That is what. That inherently, the system there is what is providing the framework for horror. So don't tell me that game is more horrific just because of the way it's written. It's the mechanics support the method of play, and likewise, Wrath and Glory can support a diverse type of story play. I mean, hell, if you really wanted to, you can tune Wrath and Glory quite happily for high school kids or younger to play, and just dial back a lot of stuff, because that's the joy of it. It's a toolbox.
And a lot of stuff has been, because I pick up, I think I've got most, if not all, of the PDFs and things that come out on Drive Through or through Cubicle 7, Church of Steel, Litany of Lost, the Forsaken Handbook.
Systems Guide, yeah.
Thank you. So I sort of picked them up and read through them, and was one of the most recent ones, the Null Sisters, I think it was.
Yeah, that's been a smaller one, so you can play pariahs, and that's really interesting. I think there's another one that's been announced that I've worked on, which is basically it's the Beastry book for Wrath and Glory. And that's all I'm going to say. There's a lot in there. There's a lot in there. It's been hotly anticipated by fans of the system for a while to have all the classic antagonists statted up, ready to maim and kill. And it was very fun to explore certain stuff for it, because I have my favourite factions. I'm not going to say them now, because I think it's going to be a spoiler. I'll wait until it's out. But there's a lot of great work on it. It was a fun team to work with, because because everyone has you get your section, but also like you have your favorite things, like because you just like a certain faction, like, oh, who's writing that? It's like, can I just have a look, because I just want to see what's going in, and like go, oh crap, that's going to be terrifying to use in a game. I think that's going to be really great, and there's some other really cool products coming up for Wrath and Glory. There's at least, oh god, actually, there's 3 books I've written on which are either coming up soon or a bit later, because of scheduling. They've changed when things, and it's like it's been pretty exciting for Wrath and Glory recently. So I obviously I'm always going to like people go, oh, you're going to shill it, but I am proud of what's put out for it and from the team on it.
I don't mind shilling
And
it by proxy. I like the game, so.
And Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is always, by the same way, has always been hilarious to work on because tonally you can get a little bit more dark humor into it. I will say also with Wrath and Glory, if you play it straight, you do have hilarious black comedy moments occur in it because satire. If you play 40k too seriously, it's just tiresome. If you play it just with a little eye for those Blackadder elements of satire, then you're doing it right because then the setting is just like, I can't believe this is bonkers. This is just like, it's horrific, but it's also funny.
Yeah.
And the same thing with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. That's always been fun to write on. I've written on like 2 products for that, I think. Yeah. So one of those is Hellrise Help, which was a scenario I designed as well. And the Horned Rat, which is like the 4th part of the Enemy Within campaign and replaces something rotten in Kislev. And it's basically just all about Skaven. It's just like, and Skaven are not funny. Like, they can be funny, but they can be completely not funny and scary. And that was why the writing on that book was a lot of fun as well, because Skaven are just grim when you want to get into it.
Yeah. So you mentioned games like Wrath and Glory and more universal. The experiences can be calibrated, can be sort of gauged and tailored to, should we say, to the group and the players and player expectations and things like that. So with respect to safety tools and calibration tools, do you have any favorites to use at your tables or would recommend out to others?
I think it really it's always going to depend upon your player group. When you've got your group of players and they're brand new, I like using the OK kind of check-in system, which is really comes out of LARP, which is just a nod of the head, like, yeah, it's all right, and it's just a subtle nod, like, yeah, or someone going, it's not great, and you're like, okay, because if someone goes, I'm okay, and they're waving that, they've got the hand almost flat, but like going rocking it back and forth, that kind of like that's actually to say no, it's not, but it could be better if we just check in and change things dynamically. And then there's if it's the whole kind of like cut it out kind of thing, or hands over the eye, like, no, a stop sign hand to say, no, we've gone too far on that topic, let's just leave it and move on. I think those work for me quite well. Other people like using other tools like the X card system and so forth. And you can use all flavor of things, traffic light system, whatever you think works at your table. They're ultimately tools. And I think sometimes, and again, I find it so weird, like, you're ultimately there to enjoy a game. You're going to enjoy the game if your players enjoy a game. Players are going to enjoy the game if other players are enjoying it. So I don't understand people's aversion to using safety tools. I mean, it sounds safety tools, political correctness gone wrong, blah blah blah. No, it's just like, it's just you saying, like, look, it can be as simple as you sitting down and doing your session 0, go like, what kind of themes do we want? Is this okay? And checking in. And it's because sometimes you do need to check in, even with people you've played with for a long time, because you may not know, even with your best friends, what their current life circumstance is. And so they may go like, that topic's a bit on the nose for me right now. And you're like, oh, right, okay, let's move on. And that's not a bad thing. It's just, I don't see these things as, I don't see them as kind of intruding upon my skills as a glorious games master delivering a gritty, deep horror narrative. It's just like, look, if that's too much, we're not going to run this scenario. I know there are scenarios I like running. Terrible Tale of James Magnus is wonderful horror, but is not for everyone. There is stuff in Cult I would not run for other people because it's Cult. And